Did you even ask the owner of this house for permission? The question left my mouth with a calm I didn't recognize. I had just opened the door to my condo, grocery bags still cutting into my arms, when I saw her standing there, right in the middle of my living room. Chloe Holloway, my daughter-in-law. 2 large suitcases rested neatly at her feet, as if they had always belonged there, as if this space were hers by default. She looked surprised when she saw me, then annoyed, not guilty, not embarrassed, annoyed, as if my arrival had interrupted something she had already decided was settled. She blinked, then let out that small, awkward laugh she always used when someone caught her off guard, a short, dismissive sound meant to make the other person feel unreasonable. "Hey, Ava," she said lightly, "I didn't hear you come in." Her tone was casual, almost cheerful, like we were chatting about the weather. Like it was completely normal for her to be inside my condo on a Thursday afternoon without a call. Without a text. Without even the courtesy of asking. I didn't step inside. I stayed in the doorway, my arms aching under the weight of the bags. I could feel the handles digging into my skin. But I didn't set them down. I didn't move at all. "I asked you a question, Chloe." My voice came out steadier this time. She tucked a perfectly styled strand of hair behind her ear, buying time. Her eyes flicked away from mine for half a second before returning with that familiar condescending smile, the one that always made me feel like I was being dramatic over nothing. "Ava, please," she said, "don't exaggerate. Dion and I just need to stay here for a few days. Our condo is under renovation. The noise is unbearable. They start drilling at 6 in the morning and don't stop until evening. We can't sleep. We can't work. We figured it wouldn't be a problem." She gestured vaguely around the room. "You live alone, and you have 2 bedrooms you don't even use." There it was. That sentence, the one that summed up everything. You live alone. You have rooms you don't use. As if my life were an empty container waiting to be filled by other people's needs. As if unused space automatically became public property. As if being 68 years old meant I no longer had a right to privacy. Routine, or choice. I finally stepped inside and placed the grocery bags on the dining table. The sound of canned goods hitting the wood echoed louder than expected. Chloe flinched slightly. I noticed. Her confidence wavered just a little. I didn't move toward the kitchen. I didn't unpack anything. I rested my hands flat on the table and felt my pulse thrumming under my fingertips. "Does Dion know you're here?" It was a rhetorical question. I already knew the answer. But I needed to hear it out loud. Chloe sighed dramatically, as if I were being intentionally difficult. "Of course he knows, Ava. It was his idea. He's finishing up at work and will be here later with the rest of our things. I thought he'd called you." He hadn't. And that silence, that lack of a simple phone call, told me everything. Dion Holloway, my son, the child I raised alone after his father disappeared when he was 7. The boy I fed on double shifts, cleaning offices at night and serving coffee in the mornings. The one who used to hug me tight and promise he'd take care of me when he grew up. That son now thought it was acceptable to move into my home without consulting me. As if my consent were optional. I walked toward the suitcases. They were expensive, new, glossy brands Chloe often showed off on social media. Probably bought on one of their frequent trips while I was still using the same battered suitcase I'd owned for over a decade. "And you thought this was okay?" I asked quietly, showing up here with suitcases without asking if I agreed. Chloe crossed her arms, her posture shifting from casual to defensive. "Ava, we're family," she said. "I don't understand why you're making this so complicated. It's just a few days. You always say the house feels empty." Empty. The word rang in my ears. Yes, I had once mentioned that the house felt quieter after my sister Olivia moved out last year. But silence was not emptiness. Silence was something I had chosen. Something I had earned after decades of noise, demands, and constant availability. "Listen to me carefully," I said. Something in my tone finally made her stop moving. "This house can be silent or loud. It can be full or quiet. But what it will never be is available to anyone who decides to use it without my permission. I own this home, Chloe." She opened her mouth to respond. But at that moment, the sound of a key turning in the lock cut through the air. The door opened, and Dion walked in carrying 2 more bags, wearing that relaxed smile he used when he thought everything was under control. "Mom," he said, "you're home." Chloe explained it, "Right? We'll only be here a week. 2 at most." He set the bags down as if they belonged there. He walked into my condo the way he had when he was 12, like this was still his territory. He leaned in to kiss my cheek. I didn't move. He froze halfway, confusion flickering across his face. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked. "Did you have a bad day?" A bad day. As if my reaction were about traffic or a long line at the bank. "I didn't have a bad day," I said evenly. "I came home to find your wife moving into my house without anyone asking me." Dion laughed. A genuine laugh. He ran a hand through his hair. "Mom, you're overreacting. I called you twice this morning. You didn't answer. So that was enough permission to move in?" "We're not moving in," he said. "We're just staying." He walked to the kitchen, opened my refrigerator, and took out a bottle of water I had bought that afternoon. He drank directly from it. That small gesture did something inside me. He didn't see my house as mine. He saw it as an extension of his. I closed my eyes briefly. What I felt wasn't anger yet. It was exhaustion. Deep, ancient exhaustion. "How many days is a few days, Dion?" He shrugged. "A week. 2 at most. 14 days. 14 days of giving up the peace I had fought so hard to build." "And you assumed I'd be okay with that?" "Of course," he said. "You're my mother." And there it was. The assumption that being a mother meant automatic surrender. I looked at the suitcases again. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't about a place to sleep. This was about boundaries I had never enforced. And I realized, standing there in my own living room, that if I didn't speak now, I never would. Dion leaned against the kitchen counter, still holding the half-empty bottle of water, watching me with an expression I knew too well. It was the look he used when he thought I was being unreasonable but hoped I would come to my senses soon. "Mom," he said patiently, "this isn't a big deal. It's temporary. We just need a place to sleep until the renovations are done." Temporary. That word again. As if something temporary couldn't still be invasive. As if time limits automatically erased discomfort. I looked past him, down the hallway toward the guest room. The door was slightly open. I hadn't gone in yet. But something in my chest tightened. I already knew what I would find. "You didn't think to ask me first," I said. Dion sighed. "I didn't think I had to." Chloe shifted beside the suitcases, clearly irritated now that the conversation wasn't resolving itself the way she'd expected. "Ava," she said, softening her voice in that careful, controlled way people use when they want to sound reasonable. "We really didn't mean to upset you. We just assumed you'd understand. You always do." That was true. I always had. And maybe that was the problem. I walked down the hallway and pushed the guest room door fully open. The sight inside confirmed everything I'd been feeling. Clothes were already spread across the bed. Toiletries were neatly arranged on the dresser. A laptop was plugged in by the nightstand. Shoes were lined up against the wall. This wasn't someone staying for a few nights. This was someone settling in. Dion appeared behind me, his hands in his pockets. "See? We're organized. We won't be in your way." "In my way?" I repeated quietly. He shrugged. "Chloe works remotely. She needs a proper setup. We're not going to live out of suitcases for 2 weeks. Comfortable. That was the priority. Their comfort. In my home." I turned back toward the living room. Chloe had already made herself comfortable in my armchair by the window, the one I'd bought after months of saving. The one where I drank my coffee every morning. The one where I'd cried after my friend Serena died last year. She was scrolling through her phone as if nothing were wrong. Something inside me hardened. "Chloe," I said. She looked up, surprised. "That chair isn't available." She blinked, then stood awkwardly. "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize." But that wasn't true. She realized. She just didn't think it mattered. Dion stepped between us, sensing the tension. "Mom, can we talk privately? Just you and me?" I nodded. Maybe if I spoke to him alone, he'd finally hear me. We went into the kitchen. Dion crossed his arms, impatience already creeping into his posture. "What's really bothering you?" he asked. "Because this feels like more than just us staying here." He was right. It was more. "It bothers me that you didn't even consider asking," I said. "It bothers me that you assumed my life was available to you." He frowned. "I don't see it that way. When was the last time you came to see me without needing something?" The question slipped out before I could soften it. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again. "I call you. I text you. I invited you to dinner last week. You invited me because it was Chloe's birthday and you needed help paying the bill," I said calmly. "And you barely spoke to me all night." "That's not fair." "It's accurate." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration rising. "Why didn't you say something then?" "Because I learned a long time ago that when I say something, I'm told I'm too sensitive," I replied, so I stopped. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be." "No," I said. "I'm finally naming what it's always been." He looked at me as if he didn't recognize me. "What plans do you even have, Mom? What do you do all day that you can't share your space for 2 weeks?" The question landed exactly where it was meant to. It exposed what he really thought of my life. "I don't have to justify my days to you," I said. "Wanting to be alone in my own house is reason enough." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You've become selfish. You weren't like this before." I thought of Marcus, his friend who had lived with me for 3 months years ago. I thought of my sister Olivia staying for nearly a year after her divorce. I remembered the exhaustion, the resentment I never voiced. "You're right," I said. "I didn't used to say anything. And that was my mistake." He stared at me. "So you're punishing me now?" "I'm setting a boundary." I walked back into the living room. Chloe and Dion followed. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken resentment. "If you really don't want us to stay," Chloe said carefully, "we can figure something else out." Dion looked away, jaw tight. He wasn't agreeing. He was waiting for me to give in. I sat down in my armchair, my legs suddenly tired. "Let me ask you something," I said. "If I showed up at your condo with bags, without warning, asking to stay for 2 weeks, would you welcome me without hesitation?" They exchanged a glance. "Well," Chloe said slowly, "we'd have to think about it." "Exactly." "But you're my mother," Dion insisted. "It's different." "Why is it different?" I asked. "Because I'm expected to sacrifice?" He didn't answer. I stood and walked to the suitcases by the door. I looked at them for a long moment. "These represent years of me not saying no," I said, "and I won't do that anymore." Dion reached for my shoulder. I stepped away. "This is my house," I said, "and I need you both to leave." The silence was absolute. "What?" Dion whispered. "I need you to take your things and go." "This is insane," he snapped. "You're really doing this?" "I am." Chloe raised her hands, tears forming. "Ava, please, we can fix this." "I don't want it fixed," I said. "I want it respected." Dion grabbed a suitcase roughly. "Fine, we're leaving." As they headed toward the door, Chloe turned back. "I hope this is worth it." "My dignity is always worth it." The door closed behind them, and the silence rushed back in. For the first time in decades, I didn't chase it away. The silence after the door closed was not peaceful. It pressed against my chest, thick and unfamiliar, like the air right before a storm finally breaks. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, half expecting it to open again, half expecting Dion to come back, to laugh and say this had all gone too far, that of course they'd stay somewhere else, that he understood now. But the door stayed closed. I walked slowly back into the condo, each step feeling heavier than the last. The grocery bags were still sitting on the dining table where I had left them, untouched, as if time had frozen the moment my life split into before and after. I started putting things away mechanically. Vegetables into the refrigerator, canned goods into the pantry, bread onto the counter. Small, ordinary actions that grounded me when my thoughts threatened to spiral. When everything was finally in its place, I made myself a cup of tea. I chose my favorite mug, the pale blue one I'd bought years ago at a street market. I wrapped my hands around it and sat down in the armchair by the window. And then, without warning, I began to cry. They weren't loud sobs. They were quiet tears that slipped down my cheeks while I stared out at the darkening city. Tears I'd been holding back for years. I cried for the young woman I had been when Dion was small. Exhausted and afraid but determined to be everything he needed. I cried for the years I had spent convincing myself that love meant constant sacrifice. That saying no made me selfish, ungrateful, unworthy. I thought of Serena. My friend Serena Mitchell had died last year, and I still remembered the way her hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and oranges. She had taken my hand with what little strength she had left and looked at me with eyes that held more clarity than fear. The biggest mistake I made, she had whispered, was caring more about what people thought of me than what I thought of myself. Those words echoed in my mind now, louder than ever. I finished my tea, though it had gone cold, and stood up. The guest room door was still open. Chloe's clothes were spread across the bed exactly where she had left them. Her toiletries lined the dresser. Her laptop still blinked softly on the nightstand. I walked in and began to put everything away. I folded the clothes carefully, even smoothing out the wrinkles. I placed the toiletries into a small bag. I unplugged the laptop and set it gently on the bed, not out of spite, not out of anger, but because I needed to reclaim this space. I needed it to stop being a territory someone else had claimed without my consent. When I finished, everything was neatly arranged, waiting to be collected. I returned to the living room and sat down again. Outside, lights flickered on in neighboring buildings, windows glowing one by one. I wondered how many of those windows held women like me, women sitting alone, questioning whether choosing themselves had been worth the cost. My phone buzzed. A message from Dion. Hope you're happy. I didn't respond. I wasn't happy. There was nothing joyful about asking your own child to leave. But there was something else beneath the pain. Something steadier. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. Another message arrived, this time from Chloe. Dion is very upset. I hope your pride is worth it. Pride. As if protecting my space were vanity. As if dignity were arrogance. I turned off my phone and placed it face down on the table. I needed quiet, not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet of processing something that had been building my entire adult life. That night, sleep came slowly. When it finally did, it was restless and filled with fragments of memory. Dion at 8 years old asking for food the moment I walked in from a double shift. Me moving automatically to the kitchen without sitting down. Without resting, because that was what good mothers did. But what had I taught him in those moments? That women existed to serve. That mothers didn't get tired. That their needs came last. I woke up the next morning with sunlight streaming through my bedroom window. For a moment, I forgot everything. Then the memory returned all at once. Sharp and undeniable. I followed my routine. Coffee, shower, breakfast. Each step felt deliberate, grounding. When I passed the guest room, I glanced inside. Chloe's things were still there, waiting. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was my sister, Olivia Grant. Ava, what happened? Dion called me last night. He says you kicked him out. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down. I wasn't ready to explain myself. Not yet. Around noon, I received another message, then another, from my cousin Tanisha, from Olivia again, concerned, curious, slightly judgmental. By mid-afternoon, a final message arrived, from Dion. I'm coming by later to pick up our things. You don't need to be there if you don't want to. I read it several times. I wasn't going to hide in my own home. I'll be here, I replied. Ring the bell when you arrive. The hours passed slowly. I cleaned, not because the condo needed it, but because my hands needed something to do. I vacuumed, wiped counters, changed sheets that didn't need changing. At 3 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. I took a breath and opened the door. Dion stood there alone, holding 2 canvas bags. His face was carefully neutral, stripped of anger, stripped of warmth. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dion. He walked past me without looking around. heading straight for the guest room. I stayed in the living room, listening to the sounds of drawers opening, bags zipping. 10 minutes later, he emerged, bags over his shoulders. "Can I use the restroom before I go?" he asked. Of course. As he walked down the hallway, something in me ached. This was the boy who used to run barefoot through this space. Now he was asking permission to use the bathroom. When he returned, he stopped at the door and finally looked at me. "Is there anything you want to say?" There was so much, but I chose the truth. "I love you," I said, "but I won't sacrifice myself anymore to avoid your discomfort. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be one where we both matter." He nodded slowly. "Goodbye, Mom." "Goodbye, Dion." The door closed. And once again, the silence returned. This time, it felt heavier but also honest. The condo felt different after Dion left. Not empty, exposed, as if the walls themselves were watching me, waiting to see if I would regret what I had done. I stood in the living room for a long time, listening to the distant hum of the city outside, the sound of someone's television through the wall, footsteps in the hallway. Life continued as if nothing had happened, and yet everything had. That evening, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't read. I sat by the window with my coffee growing cold in my hands, replaying every word, every expression on Dion's face. The confusion, the anger, the disbelief, the look that said I had violated an unspoken rule. Mothers don't do this. Mothers don't say no. Mothers don't choose themselves. My phone buzzed again. Olivia. I let it ring. It buzzed a second time, then a third. Finally, close to midnight, I answered. "Ava," she said immediately, her voice thick with concern. "What is going on?" "Dion called me in tears. He says you threw him out like a stranger." I closed my eyes. "I didn't throw him out," I said quietly. "I asked him to leave after he moved in without asking." There was a pause. I could almost hear her processing that. "Well," she said carefully, "maybe he should have called first. But he's your son. Surely this didn't have to go that far." There it was, the soft reproach wrapped in reasonableness. "I didn't want it to go that far," I replied, "but it already had." Olivia sighed. "Ava, families help each other. That's just how it works." I thought of the year she had lived with me after her divorce. Of the bills I hadn't mentioned. Of the quiet resentment I never voiced. "Do you remember when you stayed here?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "You were very generous." "I was scared," I said. "Scared that if I set limits, you'd think I didn't love you." She didn't answer right away. "You never told me you felt that way," she said finally. "I know," I replied. "That was my mistake." The call ended without resolution. Not angry, not comforting, just unfinished. The next few days passed slowly. I went to the grocery store. I met friends for coffee. I laughed at the right moments and nodded in the right places. But there was a constant pressure beneath everything, like a bruise that hadn't healed. At night, guilt crept in. It whispered familiar things. "You're alone now. You went too far. You chose pride over love." I remembered Serena again, her thin fingers squeezing mine, her voice steady despite the machines surrounding her. "Don't wait until it's too late." On the fourth day, Olivia called again. This time, her voice was different. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what you told me. About when I stayed with you. I never once asked if it was okay. I just assumed, and that wasn't fair." Something loosened in my chest. "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know." 2 weeks passed. I didn't hear from Dion. Not a text. Not a call. I told myself I was prepared for that. But preparedness doesn't stop the ache. One afternoon, while choosing tomatoes at the market, my phone rang. Dion. My heart raced as I stepped aside to answer. "Hello?" "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded different, less sharp, less defensive. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm okay," I replied. "And you?" There was a pause, traffic noise in the background. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said. "About what you said." I waited. "You were right about one thing," he continued. "I showed up without asking. I assumed you'd be available. That wasn't okay." Tears welled unexpectedly. Thank you for saying that, I said. Chloe and I talked. He went on. She says I've always treated your generosity like an obligation instead of a gift. I didn't want to hear it. But I think she's right. Hope stirred, cautious and fragile. I was wondering, he said, if we could have lunch sometime. Just you and me. I'd like that, I replied. We met the following Saturday at a small restaurant halfway between our homes. Dion arrived on time. He looked older somehow, quieter. At first, conversation was awkward, safe topics, work, weather. Then, halfway through the meal, he put his fork down. My whole life, he said, I've seen you as my mother first and a person second. I never asked what you needed. And that was wrong. Tears streamed freely now. I didn't stop them. When you asked me to leave, he continued, I felt rejected, but I also realized I'd never thought about what it cost you to always say yes. I reached across the table and took his hand. Thank you, I whispered. We talked for hours, not perfectly, not without pain, but honestly. The months that followed weren't flawless. Old habits surfaced, but now, when they did, I spoke, and he listened. One afternoon, weeks later, I sat in my armchair by the window, coffee warm in my hands, sunlight spilling across the floor. The condo was quiet, not empty. Peaceful. For most of my life, I thought love meant giving until nothing was left. Now I knew better. Love also means stopping. It means saying enough. And trusting that if a relationship is real, it will survive the truth. The weeks after that lunch passed quietly. Not the awkward silence of avoidance, but the kind that allows things to settle into their proper shape. Dion and I didn't suddenly become close in the way movies like to promise. There were no dramatic apologies, no instant healing. What we had instead was something far more fragile and far more real: space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space to relate to each other differently. Sometimes days went by without a call. Sometimes I was the one who reached out. Sometimes he was. And for the first time, the balance didn't feel one-sided. I no longer felt like I was waiting to be needed in order to matter. One afternoon, Dion called and asked if he could stop by for coffee. He asked. That single word still carried weight. Yes, I said, I'd like that. When he arrived, he stood in the doorway for a moment, almost uncertain. He didn't walk in like he used to. He waited. Come in, I said. He smiled, small and genuine, and stepped inside. We sat at the table. I poured coffee into my blue mug and handed him one of his old favorites. We talked about ordinary things. His work, a project that was giving him trouble. Chloe's new role at her company. Not once did he check his phone while I was speaking. Before leaving, he hesitated, then said quietly, Thanks for letting me come by. Not for the coffee. Not for the space. For letting him come by. After he left, I sat alone for a while, absorbing the moment. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was respectful, and respect, I had learned, was the foundation I should have built everything on from the beginning. There were still moments of doubt, nights when guilt resurfaced, whispering that I had almost lost my son, that I had risked too much. But then I would remember the woman I had been before, the one who said yes even when it hollowed her out. The one who mistook exhaustion for virtue. I didn't want to be her anymore. I began to notice changes beyond my relationship with Dion. With Olivia, our conversations shifted. She asked before coming over. She offered to bring things instead of assuming I would provide them. One afternoon, she said something that stayed with me. I didn't realize how much I took you for granted. She admitted, you always made it look so easy. It hadn't been easy, I had just been quiet. I spent more time doing things that belonged solely to me. Long walks without a destination. Afternoons on the balcony with a book I wasn't rushing through. I said no to invitations when I didn't feel like going. And yes when I truly wanted to. The world didn't collapse because of it. People adjusted, or they didn't, and I learned that either outcome was survivable. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked older than I used to, softer around the edges, but there was something in my eyes that hadn't been there before. Certainty. I thought back to that Thursday afternoon, the suitcases by the door. Chloe in my living room. Dion walking in as if nothing had changed. At the time, it had felt like a breaking point. Like I was shattering something fragile and irreplaceable. Now I understood it differently. That moment hadn't broken my relationship with my son. It had broken an illusion. The illusion that love required self-erasure. The illusion that being a good mother meant being endlessly available. The illusion that my needs were secondary by default. One Sunday morning, Dion called again. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how I talk about you. About how I talk to you." I listened. I realized I used to introduce you as my mom, like that was the whole story. He continued, "I never thought to say your name, Ava." Hearing my name from him, spoken with intention, did something to me. "I want you to know," he added, "I'm proud of you." I closed my eyes and let the words settle. "Thank you," I said, "that means a lot." That night, sitting in my armchair by the window, I watched the city lights blink on one by one. My condo was quiet, orderly, entirely my own, not because no one cared, but because I had learned to care for myself. For most of my life, I believed love meant giving everything until there was nothing left. I believed endurance was the same as devotion. I believed silence was kindness. I was wrong. Love also means boundaries. It means dignity. It means teaching people how to treat you, even when it's uncomfortable. That day I asked my son to leave my house was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of truth. A truth that hurt, yes, but one that made room for something healthier to grow in its place. I am still a mother. I love my son deeply. But I am also a woman with a life that belongs to her. A home that is hers. A voice that will no longer stay quiet to keep others comfortable. And if there is one thing I know now, it is this. Setting boundaries doesn't destroy love. It reveals whether love is strong enough to survive honesty. My house is still my house. My life is still my life. And at 68 years old, I am finally the owner of both. There are moments in life that look small from the outside. A closed door, a raised voice, a suitcase left behind, but from the inside, those moments are earthquakes. They rearrange everything you thought you knew about yourself. For a long time after everything settled, I kept returning to that afternoon in my mind. The sound of the door closing behind Dion. The stillness that followed. I replayed it not because I wanted to suffer, but because I wanted to understand who I had been in that moment. The woman who finally said no. The woman who didn't chase after her child to undo the discomfort she had caused. That woman still felt unfamiliar to me. Some mornings, I would wake up and for a split second forget what had changed. Then the memory would return. And with it a dull ache. Not regret, not guilt exactly, just the awareness that something fundamental had shifted. And that there was no going back to who I used to be. I realized how deeply I had been trained to believe that my worth was measured by my usefulness. How praise had always come when I gave more. When I endured quietly. When I didn't ask for anything in return. I had mistaken approval for love. And exhaustion for virtue. When that pattern breaks, it doesn't shatter cleanly. It frays. Old habits tug at you. The urge to explain yourself resurfaces. The desire to be seen as good returns in subtle ways. But each time I felt that pull, I reminded myself of something important. Peace that depends on your silence is not peace. Love that requires your disappearance is not love. One afternoon, while sitting on my balcony, I watched a woman across the street arguing softly with someone on her phone. Her shoulders were tense, her movements sharp. She ended the call, stood there for a moment, then leaned against the railing like she was carrying something too heavy to name. I wondered how many women around me were doing the same thing I had done for decades. Carrying emotional weight quietly, believing that saying no would make them unlovable, that asserting themselves would cost them the relationships they valued most. I used to think my story was unique. Now I know it's painfully common. We are taught, especially women of my generation, that endurance is strength. That self-sacrifice is noble. That love means availability without limits. No one teaches us how to stop. No one prepares us for the moment when continuing to give costs us ourselves. Dion and I still have work to do. Our relationship is better, but it is not effortless. Sometimes he forgets. Sometimes I have to remind him. And sometimes I still feel that old hesitation before speaking up. But now, when I do speak, I don't apologize for existing. Recently, he called me to ask if I could watch their dog for a weekend. He asked, and I said no, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. I had plans. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, okay, maybe another time. And that was it. No guilt. No anger. No emotional debt. I hung up and smiled, not because I had refused him, but because I didn't feel like I had to explain myself. That's how you know something has changed. I still sit in my armchair by the window every morning with my coffee. The same chair, the same view, but I am not the same woman. I occupy my space differently now. Fully, without shrinking. Sometimes I think about Serena. About how close she came to never saying no. About how many women never do. I wish she could see me now. I wish she could see that her words didn't disappear into the hospital air. They stayed. They grew roots. I don't know what the future holds for me and my son. Relationships are living things. They change. They bend. Sometimes they strain. But what I do know is this: any relationship that survives only because one person keeps giving up pieces of themselves is already broken. I am no longer willing to disappear to keep the peace. And if you're listening to this and something inside you feels tight, uncomfortable, or painfully familiar, I want you to know something. You are not selfish for wanting space. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. You are not unlovable for saying no. Sometimes the quietest form of courage is choosing yourself when the world expects you to disappear. If this story resonated with you, let me know by giving this video a like. I'd really love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Write it in the comments. And if you want to support stories like this, you'll find a way to do so below. Thank you for sitting with me in this moment. Thank you for listening. And remember, revenge doesn't always look like anger or confrontation. Sometimes, it looks like silence, dignity, and a door that finally closes. Months have passed since that afternoon, the one that changed everything without looking like it would. Time has softened the sharpest edges, but it hasn't erased the memory. It hasn't turned it into something distant or abstract. It lives with me, quietly, like a scar you stop noticing until you brush against it and remember what it cost to heal. My life didn't transform overnight. I didn't suddenly become fearless or perfectly self-assured. I still hesitate sometimes before saying no. I still feel that old reflex to explain myself, to justify my choices, to make sure everyone around me is comfortable, even when I'm not. But now, I notice that reflex, and that alone is a kind of freedom. Dion and I talk regularly now. Not every day, not even every week, but when we do, the conversations feel different. There is more listening, more pauses, less assumption. He no longer walks into my home as if it belongs to him. He waits, he asks, and when he forgets, when old habits surface, I remind him, not with anger, not with drama, but with calm clarity. This doesn't work for me. And the world doesn't end. I used to believe that love meant bending until you broke. That endurance was proof of devotion. That the more you suffered silently, the more you were worthy of being loved. Those beliefs weren't born out of nowhere. They were handed down, quietly, from women who didn't have the luxury of choosing differently. Women who survived by being agreeable, invisible, endlessly accommodating. I don't blame them, but I no longer follow them. I think often about how many times in my life I said yes when I meant no. How many times I swallowed discomfort because it felt easier than confrontation. How many years I spent being praised for my generosity while slowly disappearing inside it. No one ever told me I could stop. No one ever said, "You're allowed to take up space, too." So I had to learn that lesson late. At 68, at an age when people expect you to settle into who you've always been. Not to redefine yourself, but maybe that's the greatest lie of all, that growth has an expiration date. I still sit in my armchair by the window every morning. The light falls the same way it always has. The city sounds drift up from below. But I occupy that space differently now. I don't shrink inside it. I don't wait for permission to exist there fully. Sometimes, when I see older women rushing through their days, apologizing for taking up space, laughing off their exhaustion, I want to stop them. I want to tell them what I learned too late, that love does not require erasure. That kindness does not mean compliance. That being needed is not the same as being valued. But I also know that everyone reaches that understanding in their own time. Or not at all. A few weeks ago, Dion and I were having lunch again. At the end of the meal, he looked at me and said something simple. "I'm glad you didn't give in." I raised my eyebrows, surprised. "If you had," he continued, "nothing would have changed. I would have learned that I could keep crossing the same line and you'd always move it for me." I didn't respond right away. I just nodded. That was the moment I understood something: fully setting boundaries isn't just about protecting yourself. It's also about teaching others how to grow. I didn't push my son away. I stopped enabling a version of him that didn't know how to respect the woman who raised him. And in doing so, I gave us both a chance at something better. There are still people in my life who don't understand my choice. Who think I became cold, difficult, selfish. I've learned to let that be their story, not mine. I no longer exhaust myself trying to correct narratives that were never written with my humanity in mind. What matters is this: I wake up in a home that feels like mine. I move through my days without the constant weight of obligation. I love my son without losing myself in the process. That afternoon, the suitcases, the confrontation, the closed door, was not the end of my relationship with him. It was the end of a version of me that survived by shrinking. And that ending was necessary. If you're listening to this and feeling that familiar tightness in your chest, that sense that you've been giving more than you can afford to lose, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to stop being the solution to everyone else's problems. Revenge doesn't always look like shouting or punishment. Sometimes, it looks like silence, like dignity, like a boundary that finally holds. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, let me know by liking this video. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Leave it in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength and reclaimed lives, you know where to find them. This is not the story of a mother who lost her son. This is the story of a woman who finally found herself.